So here we have our model, which has been textured and has had some of the elements extracted out using the XREF. And what we're going to do in this video is to set up the render settings in their most basic format so that we can get the first couple of test renders out, as well as setting up a preliminary lighting for the daylight. We can then go back and improve those settings as we go along, but the main thing is just to start with the pure minimum and then to build on top of that. So first let's open up our render setup. And I'm going to go through each of the steps that I take to create the initial images. So the first thing is I decide how big I want my image. So for example, let's just go up to 800 by 500, and I can lock that into place. I can use a more formal approach to the width and the height if you want to go PAL, or if you want to go any of the other standard formats. It's up to you. I go directly across to global switches and I untick some of the more complex filtering displacement, just in case we have displacement on materials. We just want to get rid of most of that. Here I generally put a very small number, 0.1 or 0.15 works fine. And down here, usually you can leave anti-aliasing on. I leave it off just because I don't need it in the beginning. And for the environment, we are going to start with daylight, so we can leave this color as is. I like to generally add a slightly darker blue just to get slightly richer hues into the scene. So let's leave that in place. Since when we say daylight, we're actually going to be doing a little bit more of a sunset daylight and not a complete night shot. So that is what we're going for here. Into the reflection, we can leave it as it is, or we can go straight ahead and opt for a HDRI. So I've got a HDRI prepared for you. Let's go and reset these materials, and let's go and add a HDRI material, or rather light. So V-Ray HDRI, we're going to browse for that in our texture folder, and here we have Sky 0041. It'll be available for you in the working folder. Here we need to just go through the options to see which one it is. Sometimes it'll be angular, sometimes it'll be spherical, or other, depending on how which type of file it is. Then the horizontal rotation is really the only one that I manipulate, as well as the overall multiply. It's just these two that I really go for if I want to turn the sky depending on where the sun is coming from. So that you just have to have a look at, see if it's correct in your scene, and if not, make an edit to that. Everything else I pretty much leave in its default position. Can drag that across as an instance into your scene. If you like, you can light your scene using the HDRI. It would be more realistic that way. I like to keep it as a reflection only if I'm doing more basic renders. Then let's move across. Let's turn on GI. I generally use the light cache. You, I'm sure, have your own methods. Again, this video is not really going to concentrate on the render settings or the lighting or the texturing. It's mainly going to focus on the workflow. So I'm aware that everybody will have their own preferences for what type of engine to use and what type of settings to go for. Everybody has a different spec on their computer, so it'll also depend on that. I'm going to just drop everything down to their bare minimums so that we can get the initial images. Going to turn off filtering. In the settings, we can drop that if we want to. 0.1 is a bit rough enough. Here I'm going to add 3000, just because I am using a 32-bit system at the moment, so it will not register more than 3.5. So we'll just put 3000 there to have it slightly below our max. I'm going to untick that, and that is pretty much it for the render dialog setup. So next thing is we're going to create our primary light, which is going to be a V-Ray sun. Here we can click that on, but it won't really make too much of a difference with our HDRI and the reflections. For the sky, we'll most likely be editing that in post in Photoshop or other. So for the sun, now again here there are different preferences done by different schools of people. I'm one that likes to drop my intensity value right down. Other people leave it at 1 and then adjust for, or at least compensate for that in their camera settings. Personally, this is what I prefer to do, simply because it makes the images, that makes the shadows a lot lighter when I really basically compensate for this low amount of light coming from the sun. Size multiply, I generally pull up to 2, and then you can fiddle with the other values as well, but it's not 100% necessary. Just the main thing that you want to look at just before we go out of this, we can increase the radius just so that it covers the main area of your sight. What this will do is it'll push all the photons coming out of the light and focus them on your scene so that you don't have unnecessary light being emitted where you don't really need it. So for the first camera, we're going to add a V-Ray camera, and let's create one from the side. And this camera, we can either, I generally like to turn off the vignetting. Here I usually use a neutral or a custom depending on how my images start turning out. Generally the ISO I leave at 200, and the shutter speed is the one I manipulate. Let's start with a value of 10 and then see how that looks. In elevation, I'm going to lift the camera up slightly, and the target as well, and we'll manipulate the camera later. And now just before we press render for the first test, what I'm going to do is I always like to set up a override material using a standard V-Ray material, and I'll call that override. Let's just call it over to shorten it, and I'll make it a medium gray texture. Now, if in your render setting dialog, you can go across to global switches and you can check your override material. You can drag that across. If I press C for camera, we'll be able to manipulate our first camera view. Would be a good time now that we're starting to get ready to render. We can turn on our context model, and we can start to manually position the camera the way we want to see it. Now, one last thing. Before we finish setting up the camera, generally it is a good idea in architectural shots to click your guess vertical. What that'll do is it'll convert, or at least merge or converge your lines so that all the verticals are in fact vertical. This is especially important for these type of tower shots, otherwise you'll end up having these highly parallelogram type images where you get splayed out wide base, and it won't really look as clean and professional as a perfectly vertical image. So now that we're ready, I'm going to pause the video here, and I'm just going to do the first test render of this shot in exactly these settings that we've set up, and we'll just see according to that whether we need to make the camera, what adjustments we need to make to either the camera or the light. So I'm pausing here, and we'll come back in 1 second with the completed test render. So here is my first test render without having made any adjustments since we last set everything up, and immediately I can see what changes I need to make. Now this render was extremely quick, it only took a few seconds because we are not really showing any textures and our model is fairly simple. So what we're going to do now is we're just going to look at the sun. We're perhaps going to change the position and the brightness, and we're going to try to create slightly more of a sunset in mood to this image. So again, I'm going to pause it, and or at least before I pause it, let's just have a look at how we can manipulate the sun. So let's grab the sun, and in side view, let's pull it down a little bit, and instead of 0.3, let's make that 0.2. Also, by pushing it down, being a V-Ray sun, it will automatically become less bright. So we must take that into account as well. Then on your camera settings, we can see what it'll look like if we darken this. Shutter speed will be slightly quicker. And let's go back into our camera view. Again, I'll pause it and do that render. So here is the second one, and we can see that it is in fact much darker, and we're not seeing as much of the sun as we would like. So we're just going to go back to the sun value and ramp that up a little bit, and then do another test just to see if we are slowly getting there. So the sun we can actually try to pull up to 0.5, or let's be more dynamic and just go up a tiny notch. And I think that's enough for now. We can just immediately go back into the test. I'm going to pause and we'll have a look at the result. So here is that test render complete, and we can see that the sun is slightly brighter. We're getting a nice warm yellow on the sunny side, and we're getting that cool blue from the surrounding GI that we have on the scene. So now that we're more or less happy with the sunlight, we are going to turn on the textures. We're going to deactivate the override material and do another test render just to check, and after that we'll be ready and finished with this section of the video. So there we have it. We have the test render complete with the materials on, and we can see that the reflection from the HDRI is now showing in the water. We can see what the facade is doing, and we can have a look at how the facades on the city model are starting to act. Now, just take note that this is a low quality render. It took about 3 minutes to complete, and also take note that the file size of this entire model, excluding the XREF parts for the city and the palm trees, is about 2.5 megabytes. And that is really what we're trying to achieve with these big scale files, that we want to get a very large project like this into a tiny file size with very few objects or very few points that we manipulate to affect a great deal of things. So that is it for this video. What we covered is the render setup as well as the initial lighting setup. And in the next video, we're going to have a look at adding a few feature lights into these pavilions and perhaps up this facade, and then doing one last final render that we will pull over into Photoshop just to do a little photoshopping of the background, the sky, and a few other things that we can touch up there. So thanks very much for this, and about 1 or 2 more videos to go, and then we're done.